everybody. Welcome to this entry in the DAFilms Conversation series. Today I'm joined by filmmaker Gabe Klinger, whose film Double Play, James Benning and Richard Linklater is currently available on DAFilms. So Gabe, thank you for joining us here in the digital space.
Thanks for having me.
Where are you joining us from today? I'm
in São Paulo, Brazil.
Mm-hmm. So we're connecting Sao Paulo and Prague today. But, what I thought was interesting when I was rewatching this film again today, I think I saw it when it came out in 2013. I'm watching it again today, 10 years later. I was kind of struck, pleasantly surprised to see how much both James Benning and Richard Linklater in the film talk about time and talk about the passing of time. Because, of course, for each of their films, this is very much part of, what they're about. And at that time, Richard Linklater was working on Boyhood, which would come out a year later, and had just finished the Before Midnight. So, in the film, like this idea of time passing is very much present. And of course, then, the irony is not lost on me that here we are 10 years later. So I guess my first question is, how do you feel 10 years out from this film in a similar way to how, they feel looking back on their films?
Yeah, I think, a few things have happened that have, I think, made the film even more relevant historically. As part of this collection called Cinéastes or Cinéma de notre temps, Cinema of Our Times, that was produced originally by ORTF, the French public TV, and then that became later, the collection was continued through Arte, and it was always André Labarthe and Janine Bazin, André Bazin's widow, who were the founders of the series. And André, after Janine passed away, André tried to kind of keep the series going for a while after Arte had ceased their support for it, and he was doing that through a French cable channel called Ciné Plus. So that's actually where we came in. We came in the Labarthe stage, where he was still being supported by Ciné Plus. He had kind of like a pipeline deal with Ciné Plus, and so anything that he would bring to them, they would greenlight. And so that was really advantageous for us, because I could just bring Andre a bottle of whiskey to his house, and I could say, "What do you think about a movie about James Benning and Richard Linklater?" And he sort of immediately said, "Sure, I'll take it to Ciné Plus. That sounds like a great idea." And all we had to do to kind of unlock that money was get a French producer on board with an actual production company that would, sign all the bills and pay people out and all that. And so we started to have to organize it like a real production. And Andre just kind of, would sit in the sidelines of that and supervise, and then finally, of course, sign off on the final cut. But he wasn't really concerned with the final cut or anything. And then we'd have to deliver a 53-minute cut for the broadcast slot, I think. And then I ended up coming up with 70 minutes because there are no rules, and if you wanted to, let's say, show the movie at festivals. And so I thought, okay, well, let's have a festival cut. That got into Venice. That was the inaugural year of the documentary on cinema program at Venice. And these festivals like Cannes and Venice were starting to do these sidebar programs of cinema docs, right? Like that had never fully been a thing yet at these festivals. I think Locarno was doing something. They still do it, the Histoire du Cinema section and all that. And so we got this prestigious award out of Venice. That was the first time that something like that had happened in the series, in Andre and Janine's, Cinema de Notre Temps series. And so Andre was particularly proud that the movie was able to was eligible for a prize, and then was able to get a prize from a major festival. And so that kind of launched us on an unexpected journey around the world, really. And the film was supposed to just kind of live on French cable. It was supposed to be screened there and exclusively there, and it would be picked up in the usual cinephile circles. And then here we were screening in like the big screening rooms at the BFI and the Sydney Film Festival and all this stuff. And Benning was traveling around with me to the TIFF Bell Lightbox and to all these, you know, corners of the world, really, and on several different continents. And the movie was made for like $60,000, which is a very negligible amount of money for most, you know, filmmakers. And a big part of that was raised through Kickstarter, which was kind of in its zeitgeist too, right? At that moment, like Kickstarter was, I think, more of a sustainable thing than it is presently, where there are different crowdfunding, crowd finance sharing platforms and things, and maybe Kickstarter played out a little bit. I don't know. So it was just like a combination of all these great things that sort of aligned for us. And then Andre was already sort of winding down the Cinema de Notre Dame series, and I think they only ended up making a few more shorts and features. And then he passed away in 2018, I believe. And so that kind of that's it. That's this, you know, once Andre was gone, the series concluded. It's its own thing now. It's its own collection, and there will be no more of these. So, you know, people can take Andre didn't really pass on the torch, but people can take some kind of a torch and make their own films. But I think for me, what was really, and there's so many films about filmmakers now and filmmaking and all that, and we were already sort of past like the DVD extra, you know, phase of that at that point. So things were becoming a little more polished. But I was really responding to the sort of the lineage and the history of those Cinema de Notre Dame's films. And there's really great ones about Buñuel and Truffaut and up to like Cronenberg and Scorsese and Lynch and people like that. And so I was really wanting to do something in the style of those films, and they all sort of appropriate a little bit of the aesthetics of the people who made them, you know, or who the people who are the subjects of the films. And so all I was doing really is I just wanted to like just be part of that collection, and it was such an honor to be part of that collection. And then, you know, now 10 years have passed, and the Venice Film Festival documentary cinema section is really robust. They're still handing out prizes for it every year. There's been some really great films that have come out of that. And yeah, Andre's gone and the collection lives on, and Cine Plus, they keep broadcasting these. And I think Arte put out a collection of the ones that were put out during the Arte period, and Capricci did a book about them, the films and all that. And it's just nice to be mentioned in the same breath. And so when we get asked to put the movie on a streaming service or anywhere else, I think I wrote in this article for Filmmaker magazine, I said it's kind of like getting a nice new paperback edition of the film, you know. So yeah, that's just a kind of reflection on these last 10 years.
And if I can just go back to the start, something that you mentioned, you know, really in passing, is that when you went to Andreas Labarthe, you came with this idea of these two people. You know, where did that come from? Because, you know, did that come? I know that for a long time these two men as filmmakers were important to you, but where did the first kind of inkling of them as friends and you as somebody who could possibly make a film about that?
It happened. I was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin with James in November of 2012. And he was showing some of his films at the university campus cinema. And you know, I was living in Chicago at the time. I was mostly in Chicago at that point, and I was, you know, close to Milwaukee. That's like a 90-minute drive from Milwaukee. So I wanted to go see some of James's films on the big screen and follow him around his hometown for a few days. And doing that, I met like an old school chum of his, a guy named Jake Fuller, who showed me a video on his cell phone of James and Rick Linklater playing baseball. And I was like, wait, it didn't compute. And I was sort of like, wait, where was this filmed? And he said, well, James and I were driving, his friend Jake, they were driving around in Texas, and they stopped over Richard Linklater's kind of ranch, is the place where he spends most of the time in Bastrop, just outside of Austin. And they had stopped there, and I guess Rick Linklater has a baseball diamond in his house, and he's got an annual 4th of July baseball game where he gets all these people together, his old crew members and cast members, and they all go to his house and play baseball. And I've always been such a big fan of Linklater that I thought that was just like a dream. Like, how do I get invited to one of these baseball games? And then I used to play baseball, and so I was interested in in that trajectory of these two guys who had both they played baseball in college and then became filmmakers. I thought that was kind of interesting that they both had that interest, and they've made films with baseball as a subject. And so just that little cell phone video that Jake showed me with Rick and James playing catch, I just already thought that was such a great visual metaphor for what we would want to try to approach with this, right? So the idea of throwing ideas back and forth. And I went to the Berlin Film Festival a couple of months later in February 2013, and both James and Linklater were showing movies there. Rick was showing before midnight, the last of the trilogy, and James was showing I think one of the cabin films, the Kaczynski cabin film, if I'm not mistaken, and maybe something else. I think pretty sure it was the Kaczynski cabin film.
Yeah.
The Kaczynski, the one where he reads over from Kaczynski's diaries. And that's another thing that's made the film timely too, is Kaczynski has now passed away. And so that film becomes a sort of time capsule for approaching Kaczynski and his legacy, his very, problematic legacy. And so anyway, it was interesting because both of them were at the festival, very different films, very different premieres. Like Rick had this, glitzy red carpet premiere with Julie Delpy and Ethan Hawke. And then James was over in the Forum, doing the much less glamorous unveiling of his movie. And then we all got together at the after party for Rick's film. And the idea was born there. It was basically I was like, I'd love to do a documentary about you guys. And I have this guy I just met in Paris, André Labarthe, who's this legendary producer and old writer for the Cahiers du Cinéma. And he said, it's basically a go if you guys say yes. And they were kind of shy about it. And I said, but don't worry, it's probably just going to live on French cable. And they were like, well, okay. And then it got to the phase where it was becoming a little bit more serious. And I started to write them some emails, and Rick was kind of responsive right away. And he's sort of he's such a pro in terms of working with a team that he knew how to sort of accommodate me and what my needs would be in terms of crew and all that. And so I got together with a producer who I'd met in Berlin, actually, who works in Austin, and he took it on, and he was starting to sort of make a budget for us. And then I would write to James, and I would sort of try to plan it. And James was very against this, and he was absolutely wanting to sort of take control of the material and kind of make it his own, and sort of navigating that and trying to understand how hands-on he would be and how difficult he would be as a subject. That was just a big fear of mine. And because Rick was just very laid back and very into whatever we were proposing. Oh yeah, you want to go visit old shooting locations? Sure, let's go visit old shooting locations. And then I'd say to James, I'd say, well, we're going to go visit some of Rick's old shooting locations. And James would say things like, shooting locations aren't real life. We're here to film real life. Don't you want to and he's like, this is supposed to be like My Dinner with Andre. So when he conceived it was just My Dinner with Andre and with him and Rick. And it's funny that he would mention My Dinner with Andre, because that's not the kind of movie you'd think James Bennett would be interested in anyway. But I guess that was his reference for a movie of two people talking, right? So we got to Austin, where Rick was hosting James at the Austin Film Society. He was showing several of James's films, and then he would do introductions to them, and they, hang out and talk. So ostensibly, we were there as like, to sort of document that, and then to sort of add on a couple of things. And so I just kept pushing it so that we could get more into Rick's life and the baseball diamond and the house in Bastrop, the old shooting locations, all that stuff. And it just, of course, like once our crew really hit it off with our subjects and everybody was really, I mean, it just eased into a really nice shoot. And we had 2 cameras going the whole time, so I could pick up lots of stuff that was happening and not have to worry too much about being intentional about it and being too formal about it. Like there's this great Pedro Costa movie in the Cinema de Notre Dame series that's about Jean-Marie Straub and Daniel Houillet, and it's just them in their editing room while they're editing their film Sicilia. And the way that Pedro Costa conceived that documentary just formally, I mean, it's just one camera, one DV camera. This is around 2001, so, or 2000, maybe 1999, around then, where you have these mini DV cameras. And so it's, very much the aesthetic of in Vanda's Room, the Pedro Costa film from 2000. And he's very formal about it, and he's just, it's very confined to single angles and long takes. So if you look at our film, it's sort of the anti-Pedro Costa film, because we're doing it in a more traditional doc kind of a way, with 2 cameras and doing coverage and doing over-the-shoulder shots and things, just so that it could possibly cut together nicely in the edit room. Mm-hmm. And we didn't have to think about the formal design too much. Mm-hmm. Then we started playing around with that, right? And, there's a long shot in the film where James is just walking along the wall of the Lyndon B. Johnson Library in downtown Austin, or they're on the baseball field, and we just kept it in a really nice wide shot of them tossing the ball back and forth. And so, we were able to start to play formally a little bit, but it was really like, it was always going to be something less, let's say, less driven by those sort of formal decisions than the Pedro Costa film, for example, which is really, it's just a Pedro Costa movie about Jean-Marie Straub and Daniel Houillet. It's not a, let's say, a movie about them, strictly speaking. It's a movie about Pedro too, and how he sees the world and how he sees his mentors. And so yeah, I don't know. I've gone on several different tangents. I don't know if you want to refocus the conversation.
Yeah, but I mean, just going off what you said, I mean, it's interesting because this is your first film. I don't know if you made some more private things before this, but this is your first kind of listed film. So, and also when I'm reading about it, I'm so struck by the fact that you conceived this in Berlinale 2013, and then it was in Venice 2013.
2013, yeah, it was 6 months.
That timeline is right?
It's absolutely correct. I think we broke a mini record of some kind. The producers were delighted because we were in the black from day one. I paid myself back for the shooting from the crowdfunding. Mm-hmm. And then we got into a great festival like Venice, and then we got a prize out of Venice. So it's like everything worked out. The editing was like 3 months. The shooting was 4 days. There was a fair amount of archival research and stuff, but James was very kind to send 16 millimeter prints of his films to a lab so that they could have them scanned digitally, so I could use them on my timeline. And then Rick was very nice to concede rights from his films that he had the rights to. And then the films from the studios that we didn't have the rights to, like Before Sunrise, we used a fair use lawyer to be able to use them without having to pay the rights clearances, and that worked out. And so here we were. We didn't have to do expensive music or clips rights clearances. We had all the material sort of like ready to go, and the film had already been financed and paid for. So there was really nothing to stop us from going to Venice within that, in that timeline. And the surprising thing out of that is we were like, okay, well, that's it, I guess then. And then we got invited to, several dozen more film festivals, and the movie ended up like having a traditional kind of theatrical life, which is weird, right, for a little
Mm.
niche movie object thing. So, but it, like we got to do a retrospective of underseen Linklater and Benning films at Anthology Film Archives in New York. I got to curate a small program of Benning films at the Sydney Film Festival. Neil Young, our colleague in Vienna, programmed a thing, with our film as sort of a complement to it about Benning at the Bradford Film Festival, and we did a program at the TIFF Bell Lightbox at the Toronto Cinematheque, and there was
Mm.
just all these things, like just interest coming from all these different places, and it really, like, it launched me on wanting to, like, having the confidence built up to want to explore my filmmaking side.
Mm.
And yeah, I did have a couple of things that I sort of made privately or on a small scale early on, but nothing that I actually wanted to show to people. And then this came up, and I said, and everybody kept asking me, okay, what's the next documentary, or what's the next filmmaker portrait? Like, I was now pigeonholed into this, the idea of, like, now I would be this filmmaker that made exclusively films about filmmaking and directors. And I sort of wanted to fight against that. And so I ended up doing this other film called Porto, and I've been working on several other projects over the last few years, but
Mm.
none of them have been as easy to make as Double Play. So it's all been a huge learning curve. And I thought, well, great, this first one I did it in 6 months. That's how everything else is going to go. I could be like Soderbergh and knock out a couple of things a year or whatever. And no, it's, you learn the hard way that that's not how filmmaking works.
Mm. But
Yeah.
when you started making this film, I mean, you were making a film for the first time, in a kind of hectic, frantic way, but also with these two guys looking over your shoulders, like who are both kind of like huge influences on you, but also, extremely distinct filmmaking presences. So I'm also, you mentioned that Benning at first, at least, was a little bit, itching to have some kind of control over the film. But, how did you find that? Like, what did you find during those 4 days of shooting that, in relation to them also, I'm not just asking, are you more of a Benning or more of a Linklater, but,
Right, right.
you're kind of like, everything you've spoken about thus far is kind of more like a practical consideration. But when you're actually, faced with making a film, maybe I'm just asking for some kind of like reflection on that, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is certainly true of big productions where you've got so many different departments to manage and things that once it starts, it just goes, and it's very hard for anybody to sort of come in and assert their control over something. I mean, producers try to do it all the time. Studios, we hear horror stories about directors clashing with studios and producers and all that stuff. And I think in our case, I mean, Benning he's so invested in what he's doing that by the time we were actually on the ground and we were going, and there were 2 cameras and there were all these crew members running around and setting up the craft table and setting up, the microphones, the lapel microphones and all this stuff. It was sort of like, we were still a very small crew, but we were enough of a crew that I think Benning sort of looked around and he said, okay, this is totally out of my wheelhouse. There's no way that I will have any domain over this, right? And so he just kind of relaxed, and he liked everyone. He liked the crew. He liked, everybody that I had picked. And so that helped. And then Rick, he's just such a nice guy that he didn't, the couple of times that Benning sort of was a little bit brusque with me or a little taciturn, he was sort of like, he would come in and defend me a little bit. I think Benning, at one point I said, why don't we try this out? I don't even remember what exactly it is that I'd proposed. And Benning was like, that's a terrible idea. And Rick was like, well, no, hang on, let him talk, He was like, way more collaborative. And you'd think Rick would be like more of like the Hollywood guy who would be a little bit more assertive that way. But no, it was like Benning was like more of the kind of assertive producer type on the set at times. But mostly he was cool with it. But yeah, I think leading up to it was a lot more frightening than it ended up being, to have two of your director heroes looking over your shoulder, as you said. And in the editing room, I mean, I got to a place where we got a cut, and Benning looked at it. Oh no, I'm sorry, he didn't look at it. He didn't want to look at it. He saw it in Vienna at the Biennale after we'd finished it, and but he didn't care while I was editing it. He didn't care what I was gonna do with it. Rick wanted to see it, and I'd cut a trailer to help with the Kickstarter, and then he saw that, and he was like, "Oh, okay." And then he saw the print, like the finished thing, and he only had one note. I think we had used a scene from before midnight, and I had taken just a couple of seconds out of the scene, like in a clever kind of like edit, and just to, because you're dealing with when you're editing, every second counts, right? And Rick said, if you could just put those 3 seconds back in, I would really appreciate it. So like, I ceded to that request, of course, because to him, I was taking away the integrity of his editing and his vision and all that. And so that was his only note. But at the time, I remember he was like going through a very personal thing with his mom. She was going through chemotherapy treatments. And I can just imagine this guy sitting in the hospital with his mom, and he's not really, like, there's more important things than this documentary. There's more important things in life. And that's, I think in general, that was a lesson that I took from Linklater, is there's more important shit than this. So I'm not going to have an ego trip about how I'm being portrayed in a documentary. It lives. Let this guy take his movie to Venice or whatever. And so he was really chill about all that stuff. So it was a pleasure. I guess I could have really like just resumed that in a more eloquent way by saying that was just a pleasure to work with both of them.
And one thing you mentioned earlier that I can't resist asking you more about is this kind of international tour that you made with Benning with the film. Because you were, as you said, you're also showing his films along with this film.
Yeah.
Do you have many kind of anecdotes from that? I mean, the reason I ask also, not just is because of this film, but I had a very interesting Benning experience in Kalevivari, seeing Allensworth with a very unprepared audience, which was beautiful. It was a beautiful kind of chaotic experience. So it's very much on my mind, this like the way his cinema plays, to crowds.
Yeah, you mean in terms of like at festivals, if we had similar kind of...
Yeah, I mean, also like both that kind of stuff, but also showing this film, and what was his reaction to engaging with this film on tour?
Yeah,
I'm saying.
Oh, he loved it. He was like, "Oh wow, this is gonna get me some more bookings." That was like it was like an ad for him. It was like a puff piece, promo piece, and it worked. I mean, it worked. I think he did, when the movie was making the rounds, he did see a spike in rentals. So it was like Benning is like little mom and pop shop. Like, he was getting booking requests for Four Corners and United States of America and all this, and indeed, like, we were, for like an artist like Benning, getting $500 here and $500 there is extremely helpful. Whereas Linklater, I mean, that's such a, not to talk about it just in terms of like the economics, their personal economics, which I don't know anything about, but I would imagine that somebody like Linklater, what Benning is making on rentals for his films is pretty negligible next to like making movies for Paramount Pictures or for Warner Brothers, or, or making Boyhood. Boyhood was like just a tremendous box office success, right? Worldwide. So, it's on such a smaller scale that it was very important for Benning, and he really seized on the opportunity to get his work out there. And of course, there was always the audience member or two who just didn't know how to engage and didn't know how to get into it. But for the most part, like, we had people who were really excited, because we were generally showing at film festivals, and in that environment, people are just generally excited to get out of their comfort zone anyway, right?
Mm.
And we wouldn't show, let's say, in the big auditorium where all the gala things were being shown. Typically, we were relegated, not relegated. We were, we'd be assigned the really nice little art house space or the Cinematheque or museum space, and the movies always lived really well in those spaces.
Mm. And just one last question before we wrap up: have you hung out since then as a three?
No, we haven't. I mean, because we showed the movie in Austin, Texas, at the at South by Southwest, and Benning couldn't come out for that one, but Linklater was there for that. So I did get to have like one public showing in Austin, the hometown of the film, and Linklater's hometown, which was really special because all of our local crew were there, and it was just a nice homecoming for the film. And then I saw Linklater. I've seen him a couple times since then, but he opened the New York Film Festival with Last Flag Flying, and got to hang out with him for that. And when Boyhood premiered at Berlin the following year, we also got a chance to catch up there, but not the three of us. So the remake rights are completely available if Christopher McQuarrie and Tom Cruise want to stage a remake or buy the option from me. I'm completely open to it.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Gabe. And yeah, for everybody watching now or in the future, the film is available on DAFilms. Thank you so much, Gabe.
Thanks for having me, Christopher.